Thank you, Hugo. Thank you so much for inviting me here, and Catherine Grenier for inviting me to the Institut Giacometti. It's a great honor. It's a beautiful space. I congratulate you all. And it's wonderful to participate in this series of talks reviewing modernity, or as I think, having talked already to Hugo earlier, of modernities, no? And a much more global sense of the modern. I'm going to talk about Dorothea Tanning because she's been my obsession, I suppose, for several years now, since I first began the exhibition in 2015. The exhibition is now at the Tate Modern and closes on Sunday, which will be a great end, but not an end, because I'm finishing a book on her as well, as mentioned. But I wanted to situate her, obviously, within a broader frame of surrealism and my sense of surrealism as being something which, of course, has to go into the 50s, 60s, 70s, and perhaps beyond, if we're to do it greater justice, and if we're to do its females greater justice in particular. So I'm very much against a certain canonical view of surrealism, but not just to be against it. I think actually it limits surrealism as well as those many of us are devoted to introducing into the avant-garde sphere. So I am indeed dealing with Dorothea Tanning, who's an American. It's curious because she is an American surrealist, that's how she's defined, but half of her career was in France. And this was curious for me as a curator too, because institutions had a different idea of her. The French felt she was American, the Americans felt she was French. And I think this might be something about how we think about the avant-garde too. The sharing of her was problematic. In any case, Dorothea Tanning, from the start of her life, and very much in painting the picture of her own self as an artist, as a persona, in her memoir, Birthday, which she published at the age of 76, in 1986, she described her own birth as a day of great peril, this is the word she used, with high winds and a storm. She said, "My mother was terrified, so I was born." This ominous Gothic mood was somewhat at odds with the quaint town of her birth, Galesburg, Illinois, a very small, a very quiet, a very pretty Midwestern town, where one sat on one's Davenport couch, and where she herself said in her memoir, "Nothing happens but the wallpaper." And this becomes the sort of leitmotif of a lot of her writing and her art. But the idea that she grew up, as I say, in a small town where all you did was sit and watch. However, her description of her perilous birth was to symbolize, of course, a perilous career, or at least the path she wanted to take. From the age of 7, she tells us, again, it's a bit like Salvador Dali or anybody else telling us about their life story. From the age of 7, she determined to be an artist, she tells us. Also, she says, as a young girl, she said she wanted to live in Paris. Paris, the Mecca of modernism. It was then through novels that she discovered in Galesburg Library, the public library, where she got a job at the age of 16, that she discovered what she described as an alternative universe. Of course, this was a universe which she discovered in literature, which again is very common for a lot of the surrealists we deal with, the global surrealists who discovered this world in common through a passion for literature specifically. She read Edgar Allan Poe, Gustave Flaubert, Horace Walpole, Huysmans, Oscar Wilde, so quite a mélange. But these inspired her to focus her attention on writing as well as art from a young age, as I say, from the age of 16. And with her first pay packet, when she got a job assisting in the library, she rented a log cabin for 2 weeks and took her paper and her paints, determined that she would be an artist. So we have the image of a young female artist very much aspiring to something which she has only read about, as I say, in books. And by the age of 20, in 1930, she decides to drop out of Knox College, where she was studying arts. She leaves her family home, she leaves Illinois for good, and she moves to Chicago, because Chicago was where she could get a job and where she wanted to study art. However, when she goes to study art in Chicago, she again is disappointed because she says the art professors are looking for the next Picasso. They're obsessed with Picasso as the master of modernism, and so within 3 weeks, she's left and she's gone again. She then moves to New York, and she's there by 1936, and she's working in restaurants and what she describes herself as draggy jobs. So basically a little bit of acting, a little bit of restaurant work. She's doing some drawing when she can, and she's surviving largely on checks from her family who are supporting her. But of course, the curious thing about being in New York in 1936, or for those of us who study modernism and the avant-garde, is that she finds herself in MoMA, in the Museum of Modern Art, standing in Alfred Barr's exhibition, Fantastic Art, Dada, Surrealism in the MoMA, which was on from December 1936 to January 1937. And here, she says, she writes this as a kind of epiphany moment, she says she discovered her second home, Surrealism. She described this exhibition as, quote, rocking me on my run over heels. She said, here is the infinitely faceted world, the faceted world, you note, so the fractured world I must have been waiting for. Here is the limitless expanse of possibility. And she writes in her memoir, possibility in uppercase. So possibility, surrealism, it's fractured, it's a world apart, and it's limitless. And these are all the words that she uses to, as I say, evoke her at the age of 26 in New York and discovering something that was going to change her life. It's slightly romantic as a tale, of course, but it's crucial for us thinking about someone coming from a small town and deciding that this is where they were going to turn and identifying with the avant-garde voice within this Museum of Modern Art. Barr's MoMA show included works by the Argentinian-born surrealist Leonor Fini, who again was getting great celebration in New York between around 1936, curiously. And Fini would later become a great friend of Dorothea Tanning. They holidayed together, they exchanged letters together, and in some ways they were both sort of shared a particularly strong character. She also, of course, discovered dozens of works, because there was over a dozen work in the MoMA exhibition, of Max Ernst, who would become her second husband. So within the exhibition, there were certain figures, if you like, who from this stage too, she decides are intriguing, she's interested in. And Max Ernst, in this exhibition of Fantastic Art, Dada, Surrealism, exhibited Dada Max. Dada Max's work of 1920, which Tristan Tzara lent to Alfred Barr for the show, with, as you can see, written on it, Cesare Buonarroti. This is one of the collage works in the exhibition where you see Max Ernst himself, and this is a photo of Max Ernst that Dorothea includes in her own autobiography of the young Max Ernst. But we see him, of course, mocking the Western history of art, inflaying the academic tradition, the academic skill and mastery of Michelangelo Buonarroti himself. The name is juxtaposed not only with a scientific map of the rational brain, but with the bust of a woman in a white gown. So we have the décolletage of a woman. It's an intriguing work, but again, to my mind, I think it's a curious one that intrigued Tanning in particular, because she always said that as far as she was concerned, Max Ernst's work was, in her words, a constant and unassailable homage to the feminine. So she always identifies him as someone who keeps returning to, in her words, the feminine. And I think it explains to us how she saw surrealism in quite curious feminine terms from the outset. Fantastic Art, Dada, Surrealism brought surrealism to new American audiences, obviously, and to younger generations of would-be surrealists. Despite its often scandalous modes of expression and its psychosexual subject matter, which is often self-evident, it also shows us or reminds us that after 10 years, over 10 years after the first manifesto of 1924, to a certain extent, surrealism had now received museum approval, as testified by its place in Alfred Barr's now famous canonical chart of Cubism and Abstract Art of 1936, which you see behind me. So again, the idea that surrealism, this voice of critique, is simply another arrow in a diagram, which reminds us not only of a network of ideas, but how we can control voices of dissidence through this type of mapping. Alfred Barr mapped out two currents, a dialectic of rational and irrational impulses in modernist art in this chart. And in his introduction to the museum, which opened in New York in 1929, he explained the tension between the rational and irrational forces as, quote, the shape of the square confronts the silhouette of the amoeba. And again, the idea of the square and the amoeba is interesting as far as I'm concerned, because Barr's museum collection and his curatorial projects not only reflect modernism's story and this tension between the square and the amoebic, good form and the formless, but of course helped create and institutionalize it from the word go. Alongside this institutionalization through the flowchart also came a gendering of these differences, a gendering of good form and a gendering of the infime, or the feminine, which, as I mentioned, Tanning herself noticed. As Andreas Husson has noted in After the Great Divide, Modernism, Mass Culture, Postmodernism, a canonical text of 1986, with the birth of the 20th century, we observe a split between high modernism and mass or popular culture, which we wouldn't argue with, but the former is often categorized as masculinist, as rational, the latter as feminine and inferior. Hence that gendering of modernism is there from the start. And this must be kept in mind for a reading of Surrealist art as it evolved particularly between Paris and New York, between the 1920s and 30s, and then with the war, as it drew artists from across the globe to both centers of modernism. Surrealism exploited but also refused this divide, I think. It refused the divide between the good form and the formless, between the high and the low culture, and it aimed to bring low culture into the museum space, as we say, as well as art into the streets. So rather than standing apart, it was about cross-fertilization, contamination in this sense. This was, of course, evident in many works, again, which were canonical for us now, but which won considerable press attention at the time. Notably in the Surrealists' frequent use of mass-produced found objects in their many sculptural works, in their objects, including Merritt Oppenheim's object Breakfast in Fur, or Déjeuner en Fureur of 1936. As I said, it won international attention when Alfred Barr bought this work, which had been exhibited at the Charles Raton Gallery in Paris when André Breton did his exhibition of Surrealist objects then. He purchased it for MoMA, and he displayed it at the Fantastic Art Dada Surrealism exhibition. Women artists were quick to exploit the subversive potential of humor and black humor, and Oppenheim in this work teased out the tension between the civilized, mass-produced object, the cup and the saucer that one could buy in the department store, as she did, and the animalistic, primitivist, erotic associations in covering it in gazelle fur. So again, it's a canonical work to us now, I suppose, as both an object and an example of an intervention of the avant-garde on the sculptural object in particular in the mid-1930s. But what's curious for our mapping, if you like, of the tension between the modern and the avant-garde is that Barr specifically noted how this work in particular by a woman artist captured the public imagination. He said it captured the public imagination, these are quotes, as tens of thousands of Americans who came to see the exhibition expressed rage, laughter, disgust, or delight upon seeing it. So there's a range of responses, which of course is what every curator and museum wants, big groups, responses in this sense. But I think this also puts words into perhaps the young Dorothea Tanning, who saw this work in the exhibition and who I've no doubt took inspiration from it, enjoying the same sense of delight, the same sense of intrigue over how something as beautiful as a domestic object and the serving of tea could turn into something much more erotically suggestive. Her later sculptural works, I think, again, sort of show how they should be read back through this moment in her life, this kind of epiphany as she discovers the Surrealist object, the Surrealist collage and Surrealism in general, and how surrealism opens up a world of possibility. I'll come back to her sculptures later, but as you can see here in Pincushion to Service Fetish of 1965, which is one of the small sculptures in the exhibition. She also did a much larger, the size of a sofa, work which is in the Dallas Museum of Modern Art with the same title, Pincushion to Service Fetish from 1979. But as you can see here, this of course refers to the perfect domestic object, something that we normally associate with female skill, handicraft, domestic handicraft, something that shows the good wife, if you like. And what she did is turn a little pincushion into a fetish object. In 1965, it's her first sculpture object that she produced. And she said she liked the idea of people being able to stick pins wherever they chose, to turn something so simple into something fetishistic. And I think, as I say, this is something that stayed with her exposure to objects at this time. Also, I think what's curious is if you think about the press reception of women surrealists in particular at the time. So again, this is often, if you like, a narrative that we share with the public when we're doing I've done with an exhibition just on Lenore Feeney. But it's important to think how surrealism was gendered in the 1930s as an avant-garde and as something that was perfect for the hysteric or the female. So it was largely sort of presented as something which was derogatory, was problematic, showed a psychic instability. As I say, it was the idea that it was a hysterical art style. This is from a quote here from the New York Sunday Mirror, which is explaining to its readers what surrealism is all about. And you can see here Lenore Feeney, who's over in New York for the opening of the MoMA show. You can see her standing beside her painting, which is included. And we're told the female of the surrealist species is vividly represented by Miss Lenore Feeney, a lush, plump blonde who wears jet black fingernail polish, dyes her hair blue, orange, red, or gold as the mood dictates, and consults a psychoanalyst to discover the meaning of her own paintings. She is 28, a strange racial fusion of German, Italian, Slav, and Argentine. She is startlingly, flashily attractive in the Hollywood siren tradition. So again, while this is obviously a popular critic, what's important are the ingredients in terms of how surrealism has been set up. She's a kind of diva with her fingernail polish. She dyes her hair, she changes her profile. She doesn't understand her own dreams and has to go to a psychoanalysis to understand. But she's also of mixed race. She's also someone who actually comes through a lot of global associations, a fusion no less of German, Italian, Slav, and Argentinian. So we have this idea of surrealism as the foreigner, the feminine, the other in traditional terms. Tanning's life story and her art career offers us a little pin on this global map of this mixed people coming together, the sort of starlet type who seems to be a bit of an ingenue, and as a result offers us a little insight or a window, if you like, onto the map of the transatlantic avant-garde at this moment. She's an artist who navigated the dynamic between the modern and the avant-garde and who teased out the civilized domestic space and the uncivilized or erotic in her art and her writings from the start. The fact that she has been largely omitted from or marginalized in histories and exhibitions of surrealism to date also reminds us of how the musological mapping of movements in the 20th century, and in surrealism in particular, still revolves around a story of inclusions and exclusions. Both the avant-garde and the woman artist of the avant-garde have been given a lesser status, and her story reminds us that artists frequently defied their own categorization, which perhaps explains how we can sometimes explain or rationalize why they are excluded. So we say, well, now Feeney no longer calls herself a surrealist, therefore we don't need to include her in surrealism. Tanning had a problematic relationship with surrealism. Lenore Carrington said, I had a relationship with Max Ernst, I wasn't a surrealist. Frida Kahlo said, my life was surrealist, I'm not a surrealist. So often we use this one little sort of turn of expression or this one statement of an artist to justify their exclusion, even though, as we all know, figures like Salvador Dali were in and out of the movement, Roberto many of the surrealists, Max Ernst too, were invariably in and out of this movement which kept evolving, changing, amoeba-like. So it's always been a messy movement, but often with the women, as I say, their one interview statement which says, "Don't call me a surrealist," is used to justify their exclusion from what we define as an orthodox Bretonian surrealism, at the expense of trying to think differently about it. Dorothea Tanning questioned labels, as any avant-garde artist always did and has. She didn't want to be called a surrealist sometimes, but at the end of her life she said, yes, perhaps I wear a tattoo, surrealism. She didn't like the label woman surrealist more than the label surrealist. She didn't want to be called a woman artist. She didn't want to be called a feminist, and she certainly didn't want to be called somebody's wife. So the wife of Max Ernst. So again, if somebody was going to approach her with these questions, these labels, they were out the door. She also, as with many surrealists, again, worked in many media. And this explains, I think, sometimes how it's hard to categorize an artist or her, and that was a challenge certainly for me. So as you can see here again, she worked in painting, she worked in costume design, for ballet, for advertising. She collaborated with Hans Richter in films. She worked in soft sculptures. She worked in installations. So we have many media occurring across her career and within each decade of her career, which is also important. So we find a beautiful drawing, a painting, a design, and films, all, if you like, working together in a transmedia approach. And this also explains, to a certain extent, why surrealism challenges the flowchart of Alfred Barr, and, as I say, why it's often about a discontinuous discourse, a discontinuity in media, as we curate and as we teach and publish on surrealism in this way. Also, one of the other sort of challenges of Dorothea Tanning, but of many of her generation, and again there's an issue around whether we, a bit like feminism, end up talking about first generation, second generation, third generation, because I think this often also undermines the power of a movement by wanting to always insist one generation overtakes the next, rather than to insist no, surrealism actually was just a movement that lasted 60, 70 years, all in one. But she is somebody who worked beyond what we now define as the historical end of surrealism, when it announced in Le Monde in 1969 that historical surrealism had ended. But of course, in doing that in 1969, the reason Jean Schuster and others announced the end of historical surrealism in 1969 is because they felt it had not only gone global, but gone in huge radical directions. So it's almost continental identity had been lost after May 68 too. So given, as I say, she produced works, and the exhibition that I've curated shows works right up until the 1990s. Her last work included is 1997, which she painted at the age of 87 in that sense. So she was painting in her 80s. And so as a result, people will again say, but wasn't surrealism dead? It doesn't matter if her style, her subject matter, her political ambitions are surrealist. They want surrealism to have died in 1969 in that manner. And it actually is too tidy. We're thinking in terms of decades rather than ideas. So one of the main ambitions in the exhibition, again, which some of you have seen, but was to try and, as I say, almost mess up or play with surrealism through the character of Dorothea Tanning, to refuse the chronological mapping of her art. As to my mind, a chronological narrative speaks to a focus on progress and a very rational sense of the linear. I think it goes against everything surrealism, the avant-garde, championed in many ways. And as I say, to try and strictly speak about a chronology undermines the idea of surrealism being so multifaceted. Of course, when one doesn't opt for a chronology, one opts for a thematic approach. And the idea was to bring her art and her writings side by side into the display of her works across 8 galleries at the Tate, 10 galleries at the Reina Sofia, and to look how key surrealist themes that we can identify as surrealist, dominated her work, and show how they varied but kept returning across decades and media. So that you might have a work from 1943 beside a work from 1984, to show how she almost cannot avoid it's sort of like the return of the repressed, I suppose. But the idea of certain themes that keep coming back over and over in her work and how we might reflect upon them. So these themes and tropes returned over and over in drawings, in illusionistic paintings, hard edge illusionism versus loose, expressive, abstract canvases, in film collaborations with Hans Richter, which were included in the Reina Sofia display, and also in a family of soft sculptures, which were brought together for the first time, which she also explained herself. This is their installation at the Reina Sofia, which was one large room, and then they're interspersed with paintings at the Tate. But again, the point about the sculptures is she describes them as avatars of the paintings. So you have to, if you like, look at one to understand the other. My aim was to encourage people to appreciate tanning as an exemplar of the surrealist ambition of the open work, which activates a spectator, which makes, so that we're encouraged to make readings and associations. And often it's about the contrast rather than the comparison, which I feel works best with surrealism in this way. I also wanted to be true to Dorothy Tanning's own expressed interest, her own artistic stance, and her statement that behind every door or doors is always another door, which was the subtitle for the installation, the exhibition at the Reina Sofia. For Tate, we kept it simply Dorothea Tanning, because I think actually, ironically, fewer people perhaps knew Dorothea Tanning in London audiences. But again, the door motif, which is very common, we all know with the surrealists, we think of it from Marcel Duchamp through, and it's a motif which dominates her oeuvre and moves her work again away from a simple gendering or a life story into something that is very intrinsically surrealist. Her early works, as I say, might be linked to Duchamp's first installation of his own bathroom door, but right through to Étant Donné, where again we have a fascination with the door motif. And obviously Marcel Duchamp was a great friend of Dorothea Tanning, but it focuses the spectator, again, as an activator of meaning, or the person who completes the work of art, as we say, in a Dada and Surrealist manner. So this actually, if you can see here, is again the Lumière de Feuillet of 1952, which is from the Arturo Schwartz collection, actually in Israel, in the Jerusalem Museum, where again it sort of has a trompe-l'oeil effect, which looks as if the door is actually projecting into your space, but it is a canvas, but one which is triangulated at the bottom, interestingly. And the other, this is on here, so it looks as if it's projecting, but of course this is actually pure trompe-l'oeil motif. And here, which you have Door 84 of 1984, this is where you see her much more expressive style. And again, this is done in 1984. She's living in New York. She is 74. And she had a big studio at this point, which you could paint in. And you have two girls either side of an actual door. So a found door, so it becomes a combine work in this sense, and was painted in 1984. So these are works which again are in a room together. So we see how she's constantly playing with the door motif. In terms of trying to think about her as someone who maps the dynamic between the modern and the avant-garde, well, again, the life story is important up to a point, because we find she followed the path of most American artists in particular, in moving from the rural to the urban, in moving from Illinois, as I mentioned, to Chicago to New York in 1936. But perhaps more significantly, and again given her ambition as a young child to ultimately end up living in Paris, she sailed to France. So she wanted to leave New York for Paris, France, which is very much the trajectory of the avant-garde at the time. And in July 1939, a rather unfortunate date to decide to pack your bags for France, she headed there, and in her own words, she went with a list of the surrealists she wanted to meet. She wanted to meet Max Ernst in particular, Yves Tanguy. She also mentions wanting to knock on the door of Pablo Picasso. And of course, what happened is with the outbreak of World War II, her plans soon collapsed. Her father sends her a telegraph and says, "You need to get the hell out of France." As she explained her experience, my American embassy tells me to go home. The telegraph from my father says to go to Stockholm, to Uncle Hugo, because her father was from Stockholm. And so it's the narrative of immigrants. So she goes to Stockholm. She does note that the voyage had been for nothing, but that she had managed to paint from a Paris window, and that the journey to Surrealism had begun. And so here you see her obviously in 1936. This is an early self-portrait, which we have in the exhibition, but also her returning on the MS Gripshaw from Stockholm back to New York in 1939. And of course, the beautiful irony was that in arriving back in New York, and being in New York, working in 1940-41, all the Surrealists were there. So they too had been fleeing. They fled war-torn Europe and fascist invasion, obviously. And with the help of Varian Fry and Peggy Guggenheim, and the American Relief Council in particular, Max Ernst, of course, had managed to sail himself in the opposite direction back to New York. So their paths would cross. When she was in New York, she worked as a freelance illustrator. And this is again where we see sort of traces of her surrealism emerging in fashion designs, in advertisements for Macy's and other department stores. Here you have an ad for pearls. And we tend to find a constant obsession with design, with hats, with jewelry, with perfume, with the object, the mass consumer object, being slowly given a surrealist spirit as it starts to dance off the advertising page, or where, as I say, a kind of female hair turns into serpents and branches, and we have the sort of femme arbre coming to the fore in her advertising. This, more crucially for her as a surrealist, was also when she met Julien Levy. So in terms of our map, again for the avant-garde, of course, Levy was the legendary gallerist and art collector, whose gallery was critical for the migration of the avant-garde from Paris to New York, in terms of monetary success, but also in terms of acclimatizing the Americans to surrealist ideas and often deflecting them for their more political ambitions. And Julien Levy gave Dorothea Tanning her first solo show in 1944. And again, if anybody was in New York at this moment, of course, you wanted a solo show. Leonore Feeney and Max Ernst together had a joint show at the Julien Levy Gallery prior to that. Dali, of course, was greatly celebrated by Levy. But for Tanning to get her first show as a totally unknown artist at the Levy Gallery in 1944 really put her on the map at this time. And in this way, we have the idea that her story is often described, or at least her contemporaries as a generation of women artists are often described as the modern woman, quote unquote, who chose to reject the family, the home, and search independence. We saw her traveling, as I say, across the United States and to France, but she always has this almost migrant approach to living and changed homes regularly. Once she marries Max Ernst, for example, whom she meets in December 1942 and whom she marries after he has divorced Peggy Guggenheim in 1946. That's a little bit of logistics that had to be sorted. They were both married, so they managed to remarry, famously in a joint ceremony with Man Ray and Juliet Browner in 1946 in Hollywood. But they moved to Arizona. So again, it's quite interesting if we're thinking about these cities for modernism and where people are focusing their attention, because of course we find with the surrealists, they become increasingly intrigued about the landscape. Arizona appeals to them. The Hopi Indians appeal to them. And Max Ernst in particular is obsessed by the Mesa of the Hopi at the time, of course, not just accumulating a collection of Native American art, but actually studying it and reading the novels of the Hopi Sun King, for example. So they moved to Arizona and Sedona in 1946. They built their own little log cabin, which you can see here, a little two-room shack. I've just done a lot of work over in Sedona, Arizona, looking at this actual building. And of course, even though it's a very modest hand-built cabin in which they paint, they call it Capricorn Hill. And they choose, in Max Ernst's words, to live with cowboys and the Hopi tribe rather than the New Yorkers, who they feel are corrupting everything they're trying to do. So the narrative of woman and a modern couple and the international network of artists and writers who form their milieu allow us again to look at Tanning as someone who's part of a wider network which has to be appreciated, and a network which again is often denied a female surrealist, as we focus more just on the romantic relationship with one male as a significant other, or as we like to view them very much as someone who locked themselves away from that circle. However, on the contrary, Max Ernst not only had a huge circle of friends, writers, artists, etc., but he and Dorothea Tanning enjoyed a wider circle. And here you have them in 1958, because their life story, if you like, reflects not just the ambitions of the avant-garde as they move around, but also how their lives were affected, how they had to respond to World War, exile, the Cold War, McCarthyism, because Max Ernst is denied citizenship in the 1950s and 56. His passport won't be renewed by the Americans. The French offer him nationality immediately. And so he moves back to Paris with Dorothea Tanning because they have no choice. He won't be able to work otherwise. And this is them 2 years later in Paris with their circle, which again reminds us, as I say, of how the avant-garde was a network in this manner. We have Nina Lebel, Max Ernst, Duchamp, Sylvie Lacan, Robert Lebel, Alexina Nina Duchamp, and Lacan, as well as Tanning standing upright above the flowers. Insomnias is the beautiful painting behind them over their sofa, which is in the exhibition. Equally, by the late 1960s, where they've moved down to Seyon in 1965, because Patrick Wahlberg was living there, and he advised them to come down. This slide is missing its title, but we have the idea that again we have Max Duchamp visiting them on the way, and very much a friend who shares lots and lots of correspondence, ideas with them, and Wahlberg, who, as I say, was a key figure in this time. And it means that when we're looking at Tanning's paintings, her door motifs, her obsessions, chess is the other thing that brings them all together. Her role fleshes out this role of the avant-garde and how they constantly kept coming together in exhibitions, in summer, in winter, etc. When Tanning and Ernst met, she emphasized that they shared a language of surrealism, even though she had no French, he had no English, and that actually chess brought them together. She acknowledged that in 1942, when they met, he had 20 years of surrealism behind him, and it was all new for me. But she also, while describing the surrealists in the United States as shipwrecked as an avant-garde group, she says that actually there was a whole new world of possibilities opening for them too. So she says, a Paris blaze, a Paris fire, that was surrealism. Its sparks had now fallen on New York to provide a little alchemical warfare. And so this idea that it was, as I say, lighting up New York was exciting, and exciting for those surrealists who had moved to New York as much as the younger generation who were enjoying this new dynamism there. In a 1975 interview with Alain Jouffroy, she also said, I think everything we do is autobiographical. So one of my reasons for painting was to escape biography. So she really wanted to escape biography. And this is crucial for appreciation of her art and writings as exemplary of the avant-garde, because again, all too often we frame women of the avant-garde in terms of their biography alone. Where the art is personal, it still invokes the socio-political, the universal, and as we've seen from the photos, even though they're family snapshots really, you have the idea that they were always sharing books, ideas, a library together, and that this is what often turned their art in radically different directions. And certainly in terms of her engagement with design, with film, it was always due to conversations and her collective that she remained a firm figure in. She said her work was about leaving the door open to the imagination so that the viewer sees something else every time. And again, that's very much in the surrealist spirit. But we find that when she is talking about it, it's not, as I say, from a biographical perspective, so much as the idea that she as an artist might seduce the viewer into a new space, into a new set of ideas. And the motif she uses there isn't just one of the door, but also the web, which again for many of us who are trying to rethink how we look at the mapping the avant-garde, how we think of it globally, how we think of it as a network, it's curious that she talks about it in labyrinthine terms, that she's creating a web, and a web which doesn't allow her an exit as an artist so much as doesn't allow the spectator. So she very much has that idea of opening herself to the experience, much like André Masson, Juan Miro. Everyone used to define the surrealist process, if you like. But as I say, in terms of spatial metaphors, she uses this web motif too. Now, the work that's perhaps best known for Dorothea Tanning is Birthday of 1942, which greets you in the exhibition. And it documents a moment of transition in Tanning's life. It was not yet finished when Max Ernst saw it in her apartment in New York in December 1942. But he was there on the advice again of Julien Levy, who was recommending women artists to Max Ernst, Duchamp, and André Breton and Alfred Barr, who were together as a committee trying to advise Peggy Guggenheim and select women artists for her exhibition 30 Women, which was to open in her Art of the Century gallery in January 1943. So the title of the show was 30 Women, but after Max Ernst makes a visit to Dorothea Tanning's small apartment in New York and sees this work, Birthday, and decides it must be in the show, that famous exhibition of 30 women becomes 31 women. And Birthday is a title that Max Ernst came up with, or suggested there and then, according to Dorothea Tanning, to obviously suggest her birth as a surrealist. So you have the idea of metamorphosis happening before your eyes. She talked about the work and the door in the work. She said her apartment had many doors, obviously not quite this many doors, but that the door was a talisman, a symbol for things that were happening. It goes beyond the document of the time, but she does draw on the fact that this was also a way of fashioning oneself, because she says that the dress she's wearing, or part of the dress that you can see that she's wearing, was a thrift shop purchase. She said that it was an old Shakespearean costume that she often wore, and that this was something they would do, she and other young artists, particularly female artists, of course, and that they would dress in costume, in fashion, and sew things together again to sort of make an impression when she would attend a Julien Levy opening. She said, though, one had to be deadpan about it, one had to be unserious about it. And this old Shakespearean costume, of course, is beautifully offset by the fact that the skirt of the dress is writhing with bodies, with male and female bodies erotically entwined, so that you have the sense of the actual painting moving, stirring before you. The countless doors, again, of course, as I've mentioned, keeps coming up in her art. But we also note that actually this is a moment when the surrealists not just helped choose this young unknown artist for Peggy Guggenheim's show, which brought together Fini, Carrington, Kahlo, Kay Sage, so many of the women who've long been forgotten back in the 40s, when a female collector and a female gallerist decided to bring them all together. But the surrealists also seized a lot of women artists as a way, of course, emphasizing their global expansion. So Frida Kahlo was claimed as surrealist by André Breton, so the map of surrealism was getting bigger. Anglo-Irish woman artist Leonora Carrington allowed the Irish map to dominate the colony, to map the British map in this sense, and Dorothea Tanning brought in an American voice to the group as well. And so Birthday, this painting, was reproduced alongside Dorothea Tanning's story Blind Date in VVV in March 1943. So again, this was strategic, I would argue, in terms of the surrealists and how they themselves wanted to map their time of exile in New York, but ensure that the map of surrealism, as I say, remained strong and wide. Of course, famously in Arcane 17, Breton writes of the feminine, again in strong terms, as the other prism of vision. And he positions the feminine as a term specifically against male despotism. So he says the time has come to value the ideas of woman at the expense of those of man. It is artists in particular who must take the responsibility. So it's the call to arms for artists at the time to maximize the importance of everything that stands out in the feminine worldview in contrast to the masculine. This is 1944. In the same year, Max Ernst wrote for Dorothea's catalogue at the Julien Levy Gallery, celebrating her art, saying it was not orthodox realism, that hers was a new independent spirit, but again, putting her art on a huge global stage and insisting that her art was, quote unquote, a dramatized biography of the universe, no less. So there's a trumpeting of women at this point, a seizing of the feminine at this point, and very much against the masculine warring regime that is wreaking havoc on the world and the power of art. Birthday is included, as I mentioned, in the journal VVV, also Children's Games of 1942. And again, as I mentioned, in that journal VVV, we have a reflection of the greater diversity of surrealism at this crucial moment where for so many people surrealism was meant to have died or is dying with the war in that sense. It's a crucial moment of resistance for those in exile, because in VVV again we have, as I mentioned, not just Tanning but also Lenore Carrington, Alice Rachon include, the Afro-Caribbean artist Lance Césaire, and very much the idea of VVV and surrealism as a forum for a global surrealism, which together could manifest a political stance, as VVV itself indicated the title. So it was victory over the forces of aggression and of death, unloosed at present on the earth. V, beyond this first victory, for this world can no more and ought to be no more. The same. V over that which tends to perpetuate the enslavement of man by man. So this call to arms, as I say, included global and female artists in particular, and it was partly why Dorothea Tanning was seized by them, but she in turn felt surrealism was the voice for her and the avant-garde rather than the modern that even her mother wished she wouldn't turn to. Tanning's oil painting self-portrait, which is on my left here, I think can also, even though it often seems like quite a poetic or romantic self-portrait, and is certainly one which hasn't received much critical attention, I think it might be seen as part of this same mapping or tension between the avant-garde and the modern, or the periphery and the centre, as we often say. We see a small female, Dorothea herself, facing Monument Valley, the new wild landscape that she had just visited with Max Ernst, the land to which they'll return in 1946 when they're married and build a home there, when they moved to Arizona, as I mentioned. And we see her turning to the desert sun and away from the urban metropolis in this form of self-portrait, but as I say, a portrait that might also be read as a surrealist self-portrait, or a portrait of surrealism at this crucial time when it seems to be dwarfed by so much, but is calling for victory through art. Often this painting again is read in quite gendered terms when it is looked at as a kind of love crisis, as the young female who's fearful of the larger Max Ernst figure, the master, and that she might be the muse, facing life and daunted and dwarfed as a result. But again, I see it more as a proclamation, as a manifesto even, and that if we compare it to other images of males before landscapes, and if we think about the iconography typically of the lone figure before landscape, if it was a male, we would normally analyze it in more heroic terms. So obviously I'm thinking of people like Caspar David Friedrichs, Wander Above the Sea of Fog of 1918, or you might think of Monk by the Sea, and the notion of the sublime as articulated by Edmund Burke. And this is again not, if you like, peculiar, because of course it is at this very moment during the war and immediately after the war that on American shores there is a pursuit of the absolute and the sublime. So whereas on French shores we might have a turn to existentialism, in 1948 in New York, Barnett Newman claimed the sublime is now. And in an essay of 1961, The Abstract Sublime, he spoke of contemporary male artists, essentially Mark Rothko, as offering the modern sublime. And he cited Caspar David Friedrichs, Monk by the Sea, and Wander Above the Sea of Fog as exemplary of this spirit of the sublime, of where we find paintings of vision and feeling, and where we find, quote unquote, the infinite smallness of God's creatures. The Surrealists rallied against art for art's sake, as we know. They rallied against the privileging of the pure aesthetic experience. But Dorothea Tanning and the Surrealists were in the mix of this battle between the modern sublime and the survival of Surrealism at this time. They turned to nature very much as a symbol of feminine power over the modern technocratic society. And I think Tanning here faces the vista as the embodiment of that stance. She aligns it with the feminine, and I think probably is nodding to Friedrich's Woman Before the Setting Sun, again another famous work of which she would have been familiar, as she poses before this epic landscape. Later works also tend to figure the female as the person who braves the way, who's not just curious, but perhaps is the one who can lead in the new direction. So for example, Tanning's Children's Games, as mentioned, in 1942, celebrated by André Breton, and a tiny little work, sort of the same size as the Lugubius game, a beautiful little keyhole work, or the larger Guest Room of 1950-52. In these works, again, we see her seizing upon the potential of the female figure, but of course also the femme enfant, that figure that emerges over and over again in Surrealist art, but now in the context of the Cold War and in the context of its ideologically repressive environment. And she's producing these again, as I say, in the United States. So here, the femme enfant isn't the kind of passive muse, not objectified in a traditional sense, but the female, the femme enfant in this case, wreaks havoc on the interior, wreaks havoc on the home, wreaks havoc on the bourgeois space. And I think it's important to look at these works too, very much in terms of how Tanning is responding to the American situation at this time. This is 1952. She's in Arizona. She talks about closing the door on the heat and going inside to paint. But she also writes about the vigilant censorship of the erotic in the antiseptic USA. So her turn to the femme enfant isn't just activating a long surrealist figure from passive to active, making her the one that attacks and moves forward, but it is also a political, a subtle political critique of the antiseptic USA. These are her words too. It might be argued, of course, that her images of female characters, women or girls, continue a romantic view of woman as a nature, as vessel, as a symbol of the marvelous, something that we often critique. We know that the male surrealists were more than enamored of the little girl, the femme enfant, the Alice in Wonderland. We know that she would have seen Max Ernst's portrayals of Alice. Also, Lewis Carroll and Tenniel's illustrations for Lewis Carroll were included in the fantastic Art Dada Surrealism show, 36. But again, we have the idea that where for the males, Alice is staged, as I say, as an object of delight, passively loitering, sitting there waiting, if you like, for the male. She's activated in Tanning's work. And I would argue that where she does look to Alice, as I say, she creates an alternative one. So that while we might think of the iconography of Alice in Wonderland, the flowers or the sunflower, the motif which occurs over and over too in Tanning's work, doesn't threaten the girl so much as, or at least the way I see it, as forming her ally. She described the sunflower as the most aggressive of flowers. It could survive the desert heat. And I think she, in works like Eine kleine Nachtmusik of 1943, which you see here, she stages the femme enfant, as I say, as someone who attacks in the public space, who bravely heads for the sunflower yellow light, but also the idea that the sunflower itself is her ally. And of course, the sunflower is the most surrealist of flowers. We know that André Breton's writing about the sunflower. It is the symbol of desire, but also amour fou for the surrealist in this sense. So it's one pursues without fear of the consequences in terms of the sunflower. Whitney Chadwick, in her canonical and hugely influential study of women's surrealists of 1985, says that when we look at women who were part of this movement, they didn't need a muse, unlike the men. And again, I think this is curious because it sets up a very binary model for modern couples, or when we look at Tanning and Ernst. And I would say that on the contrary, not only did Dorothea Tanning stage the femme enfant, but she staged man as a muse. So she did everything that the male artists were doing. She didn't just respond to what they were doing. In her memoir, her book Birthday of 1986, she chooses this title to specifically pinpoint the moment of her birth with Ernst when he names her painting Birthday. So she pays an homage to their relationship. And she says she wants to bring him into focus in her larger life. So she sort of changes the roles so that she's the story, and she wants to make sure he doesn't get lost. So it's a little bit, it's sort of cheeky on her part. She also presents them as a pair of equals. She says that they were both, we were both, quote, painters, visionaries, and this did not strike me as unusual that we should come together. And she even describes him, I thought this would be interesting since we're speaking this place, as a fellow laboratory, quote unquote, worker. So she says, Ernst was my fellow laboratory worker. So she sets them up again as people who share a space and ideas. And she describes him in perfectly muse-like a fashion. She writes about his narrow body and the fact that his body, even at an old age, was like those of boys diving off the bank at the swimming hole. She also admired his athletic bronzed body. She writes about his silk of hands, his flowers of hands, yes, with their big fans of bones inside, strong as strong his hands, is how she describes Max Ernst. And again, this is interesting when we see her use of flower motifs, very much as sort of the symbol of her relationship with Max Ernst. She represents him as a little child, so far from the master, he's the child. In this image, Sunflower Landscape, this is Little Max of 1943. And as I say, an equal in their laboratory explorations of surrealism in Max in a Blue Boat of 1947, where we just see the back of her head and we see Max as the alchemist on the other side, and of course an empty chessboard between them, because he is the king and she is the queen of the board in that sense. So again, we have a very strong image of what they're doing. As with so many women associated with surrealism, Tanning rejected the label wife, as I mentioned, woman artist, but she was very conscious of the fact that this was a subject which would lay at the heart of surrealism. So it wasn't a problem to think about the feminine and to think about women's rights. It actually was crucial to the movement, which might explain again its attraction for so many different people and why it could survive in its diverse style. So again, this quote, she said, "I never heard the surrealists discuss the rights of either men or women. They knew woman was better equipped to confront the slippery enigmas, even to find the answers that so far had eluded man." So again, she feels that they have this insight and that this is part of, as I say, the quality for surrealism. She also, in other quotes, talks about the fact that does it matter if, when you lose a loved one, if it's a brother or a sister? Does it matter if you become a parent, if it is to a boy or a girl? If you fall in love, does it matter to that love if it is a man or a woman? Does it matter when you pray if it's a god or a goddess? Her critique was with the idea that we were focusing too much on gender. And when she made this statement in 1989, it was exactly, ironically, the moment when all of a sudden art historians and curators were looking for women surrealists. It was when we had what we called Freedomania, and when everyone was trying to find. This was the moment when the Guerrilla Girls were arguing, do women have to be naked to get into the museum? Dorothea Tanning in 1989 was living around the corner from the Met Museum. She was perfectly familiar with what was going on, but her critique was whenever anybody wanted to talk to her about feminism, whenever anybody wanted to call her a woman artist, that it was only pigeonholing or dovecotery. And she said she utterly failed to understand the pigeonholing or dovecotery of gender. She was convinced it had nothing to do with qualifications or goals. For her, again, she famously said, women artists, there is no such thing or person. It's just as much a contradiction in terms as man artist or elephant artist. You may be a woman and you may be an artist, but the one is a given and the other is you. And this is a statement which is perfectly feminist, but was her reason, her rationale for saying, you don't need to call me woman artist. You can call me surrealist, you can call me artist. Surrealist is gender neutral, but we don't need the woman label. And as I say, this was also her reason as to why surrealism continued to have a voice, because it didn't distinguish and it wasn't essentialist and separating the sexes in the way things were leading in the 1980s. This was a time, as I say, when gender and greatness were being pushed apart, if you like. She was conscious of the fact that people viewed her often as as I say, the wife of Max Ernst, but she was determined to map herself as somebody who was had to be viewed within broader terms. Of course, again, she's somebody who isn't taking herself too seriously, I suppose, you might argue, because she says these statements, don't call me a woman artist, and then she calls a so-called self-portrait from 1986, woman artist, nude, standing, defiant, upright. And this was actually after a visit to the Prado, where again she's looking at Goya, and she's doing this image of the fleshy female nude, defiant. It's perfectly feminist in many ways, and it was being enjoyed in new ways in the 1980s, but she was nervous, as I say, of being celebrated only as a woman artist and within a feminist tradition, because surrealism was supposedly passé at this point. Like Virginia Woolf's famous observation, a woman must have money and a room of one's own, Tanning obviously was fascinated by women's politics, by space, with the room, and as I've mentioned, the door. Her installation, Hôtel du Pavot, Chambre 202, is a focus point in the exhibition. And she described this as perhaps her most surrealist work, her surrealist work par excellence. And she has that in her letters to the Pompidou, who purchased this work after it's exhibited at CNAC in 1974. So she works on this installation for 3 years. She's determined that it is going to be, as I say, her kind of pièce de résistance, and it therefore is a focus in the exhibition and a focus in her career, but also in terms of surrealism's effect, or surrealism's history of installation art, I would argue. This is a work, again, which was staged in the 2009-11 show Elle at Centre Pompidou, created by Camille Morinot, and it is a work which is sort of coming out, if you like, of the closet quite literally, but curiously, very much being read as a woman artist statement, as something linked to perhaps that call for a room of one's own, so that she fashions in Virginia Woolf form. However, as I argue in my essay on this particular installation in the catalogue for the exhibition, her title again reminds us that this is perfectly surrealist as an installation, and it doesn't need the gendered frame to be a powerful work of art. Her choice of title reminds us how she goes beyond the room. So it has the subtitle Chambre 202, but it is emphatically Hôtel, Hôtel du Pavot in her title. And the hotel as a motif in terms of her images, the door is often that of a public hotel room, not a bedroom door in that sense. Her description of this 3-walled installation that you stand outside of and look in on is that it is, quote, a destitute hotel room. It is anonymous. It is everywhere. It is nowhere. And again, I think that is perfectly in keeping with surrealist aesthetics. It is everywhere. It is nowhere. The idea that it is in the everyday, the banal, and therein lies, as I say, the power of surrealism to corrupt from within, not from the margins. In this work, as you can see, there's also a play with low culture and high culture, the divisions we normally set up against the modern and the avant-garde. There's a mixing of surrealism and Hollywood, surrealism and Hitchcock, which is a long tradition. You probably may not be able to see it here. So this is her in 74, where it's actually first exhibited, posing in the installation. And of course, this is it, and you can just see there on the door, perhaps 202. So this is the number of the hotel room. And it refers again specifically to a popular song. So there's little codes which are there for one to unmap, to decipher, if you so choose. And 202 referred to a popular song that you heard in Chicago from the 1920s, which was about the fate of Kitty Kane, a Chicago gangster's wife, who poisoned herself in room 202 of a hotel, who committed suicide. So it's about room 202, where something might happen to you, is how the song goes. So it's a reference to this. We have, as I say, the kind of Hitchcock element where we can't see quite behind that door. Her paintings have turned into three-dimensional. But the pavot, or the poppy of the title, also, of course, refers to Rimbaud, to Charles Baudelaire, her favorite poets, who she regularly referred to and made notes about in her journals. And who, of course, Baudelaire in particular was cited in the first Surrealist Manifesto of 1924 as surrealist immorality. So back in 24, Baudelaire is there, tanning as notes of Baudelaire, quotes in her journals, as I say, which I've gone through. And I think, again, it's an homage to his poem of 1862, Les Chambres Doubles, where he writes again about an uncanny room, where the furniture takes elongated shapes. In his words, each piece seems to be dreaming, as if living in a state of trance, like vegetable and mineral things. There's no artistic abortion on the walls. So this is Les Chambres Doubles. But what's interesting too is you can just about make it. He says there's no artistic abomination on the walls. And what tanning has done, as you can probably see, is create a ghost-like detail, as if there's a missing mirror, a missing work of art. The idea that the work of art has actually leapt almost into the hotel room in front of you. And again, as I say, this is where we have the layers of surrealism and popular coming together in the work. She said, as I mentioned, it was her most surrealist work. She was very excited by it. And it's also a work which I think nods to what's happening in surrealism in the 1950s and 60s as it's engaging with younger generations. And she's back in France. So she's in the midst of everything that's going on. The Eros exhibition of 1959 was fabulous in terms of its installations, in terms of its velvet-lined walls, its breathing walls, designed a lot by Mimi Parent. Hans Bellmer's Poupée was in the Eros exhibition too, and often people look at Tanning and think perhaps she's referencing Hans Bellmer and her pink, fleshy, soft figures. And also, I think, or I mentioned some of details of her work again, like the tragic table, the table tragique, which you see here, might also reference works which she had noted too, like Giacometti's Woman with Her Throat Cut. Because we find, as I say, every little detail, even in something that's a huge mise en scène, speaks to all the little bits of surrealism that Tanning is accumulating and wanting to put together to make this final manifestation of surrealism in the 1970s, when, you'll remember, everyone is claiming that contemporary art has nothing to do with surrealism. So I think, again, this is a kind of a call to arms. And this idea of surrealism, as I say, in the 70s continuing, and a figure like Dorothea Tanning almost allowing us to continue to argue this, is something that I argued for in Surrealism and the Politics of Eros back in 2005. Again, very much to try and argue that we have an expansion of surrealist ideas, not just globally, but philosophically and politically in the 1960s through to the events of 68 and afterwards, where, as I say, the surrealists felt this was a triumph, 68. And they were triumphantly claiming the end of historical surrealism in 69 because it was uncontainable in that kind of sense, that it couldn't be incorporated, it couldn't be fashioned into part of a modern narrative. It actually was exploding in this manner. Of course, the historical stance that surrealism lost its spirit to the war, that modern art moved from Paris to New York with the war, was very much begun by Maurice Nadeau in his History of Surrealism of 44, but it continues in a lot of the display of surrealism in museums and certainly the teaching and publishing on surrealists to this day. this kind of, to my mind, all too quickly reinforces the modern versus the avant-garde as these two fighting spirits that should never be brought together. Equally, the male and the females as warring spirits, each other's other, who should not be brought together. However, to my mind, on the contrary, they have to be. And if we don't mix it up, we will continue to perpetuate the politics as well as the conservative politics as well as the conservative staging of the avant-garde today. The Surrealists were drawn, yes, to geopolitical centres of modernism, to Berlin, Paris, New York, but as I mentioned, they had a fabulously global network. They were Argentinian, they were Chilean, they were Mexican, they were British, they were Czech. This was always the case. They influenced and expanded modern art, and that was part of their agenda. And therefore, they have always been there in terms of, of expanding the histories of modernism. It's always been within modernism that they're moving, I think, the frames of modernism. And in this sense, it's perhaps better to think of avant-gardism than the avant-garde, in that sense, because avant-gardism allows us to move beyond the idea of the modern and the postmodern, and surrealism being squeezed in between. As we think about avant-gardism as a philosophy and a worldview, which the Surrealists began, and which is their true legacy for contemporary art and ideas today. So as I say, that's the sense of how I think their politics of eros, their approach to the body, continues to have a relevance and pave the way for a lot of later feminist artistic expressions when the body and the erotic became increasingly a political platform. Dorothea Tanning's story fits into this larger mapping of the avant-garde precisely because it allows us to complicate Surrealism story, to address not just the privileging of a few mainly white male European men in museums and in our teaching, as I say, in exhibitions, but also to her story and stories like hers allow us to insist that, as I say, the canonical view of Surrealism censors a lot of its ambitions and also undermines why so many different, diverse creative people came together across nations, across wars, and kept collectively manifesting their spirit. Her art demands that we think, we remap the avant-garde, that we identify its rhizomatic rather than its diagrammatic nature, to my mind. Her art aims to reveal and to transform, which is kind of the words you began with, again, Hugo, but the idea of transforming the world that we sort of always begin Surrealism with is very much, I think, something that comes out from an individual, but also constantly thinking about them in their collective group, as with Tanning and her Surrealist circle. It's this sense of art as praxis, and the sense of Surrealism as always being about an open work for the spectator, which allows her Surrealist voice and her contribution to the wider history of Surrealism and its politics, as I say, to continue to resonate, I think, and particularly for younger artists and a lot of contemporary artists are enjoying are turning to a kind of feminiscence that we get with Surrealism, where they're finding a voice through Surrealism. I think this is why it resonates in this manner. Ultimately, looking at Tanning within the map of the modern and the avant-garde should, I think, ask us, or should encourage us to teach and to curate Surrealism in more open, more messy terms, if you want to put it that way, and to embrace its resistance to the linear path, and as I say, to that idea that we can chart anything into a manageable grid. Thank you.